Vintage watches are somewhat its own area of horology. I'm interested in getting a vintage watch, and a military watch seems like a great genre to consider. Military watches have great historical significance, and perhaps even personal meaning. There are several directions one could go with military watches, all fitting depending on any specific criteria you may have. I'll review just some of the possibilities and the criteria I selected and my decision on a watch on this episode of Adventures with Time. If you've been following my activities in watch collecting on this channel, you know that my collection consists primarily of new watches. In fact, all of my purchases have been new watches, although I do have a couple of vintage watches that have been passed down to me. I feel it is time to dip my toe into purchasing vintage watches. I've been weary of buying any sort of used watch, especially vintage, given the possibility of getting a watch with problems, whether that be one that has a hidden mechanical issue, or isn't all original, or paying an appropriate price. But it's time for me to put on my big boy pants. As I investigated vintage watches, I concluded that I really would like to get a military watch. Over the past 3 years of collecting watches, I've owned several contemporary military watches. That is, modern watches that are styled in the design of vintage military watches. I've had the Stova Classic Flieger, a current day take on the German aviation watches of World War II. I went through a detailed survey of Hamilton field watches and purchased one reminiscent of what my father might have worn during his service in World War II. I've owned the Aviate P-51 aviation watch, and I still own a Russian Vostok Kommandersky and a Chinese Seagull 1963. All of these are modern-day homages or reissues of military watches, but not actual vintage watches. What do I want in a vintage military watch? I would really like a watch that was actually worn by someone who served. This provides me with many alternatives to consider: time period or specific military conflict, country of use, and even military branch, as well as the usual specifications one considers when selecting a watch for your own collection. I started this venture by looking at watches made for the British military during the 1980s and 1990s by the Cabot Watch Company. These are popular among watch enthusiasts, I believe, because CWC watches can be purchased new today. Working examples of their vintage issue are readily available for under $300 US. These are the G10 quartz watches that are sized at 36.5 millimeters. They follow the watch specification issued by the British government. The nice thing about these is that these watches include on the case back specific military references. But then it occurred to me that my father served in World War II in the Pacific Theater. I don't know what watch he wore during his time on Iwo Jima or Saipan, but I think it would be a nice tribute to his service if I got a model he might possibly have worn. So I turned my attention to the watches issued by the U.S. military, and there are several of these. The U.S. military had a specification for watches known as the A11 spec. Among the requirements in the A11 spec is the hacking feature, as these watches were primarily designed for aviators. A11 watches, like the G10 watches, have military references on the case back. Watches were made to this spec by 3 manufacturers: Bulova, Elgin, and Waltham. These watches are often given the tribute as the watch that won the war. These watches can be found on eBay starting at about the $300 range, higher for nicer examples. Most have black dials, but I've seen some with light color dials. Similarly, another watch specification was defined during World War II by the Ordnance Department. These watches were intended for non-aviation personnel. This is more likely what my father might have had since he was in the Signal Corps. Contracts for these Ord watches were filled by Bulova, Hamilton, Elgin, and Waltham. Or department watches also have military references on the case back, but to a lesser degree than the A11s. From what I've seen, most Or department watches come in light colored dials, although black dials also exist. I've determined that it is one of these Ordnance Department watches I want to consider for my collection. The one thing that is inhibiting me is that these watches are relatively small, especially for my 7 and 7/8" wrist. The smallest watches I have in my collection are a Hamilton AT&T service anniversary watch with a diameter of 34 millimeters. And I have a Rolex Oyster Perpetual Datejust at just 30.4 millimeters. The Hamilton has a passable size for my wrist. However, the Rolex, which is wearable, just doesn't look right on me. From what I've seen, these Ord watches are between 31.5 and 32 millimeters in diameter. So these are at the very small end of watches I can wear. My concern is that because of its size, I might end up not wearing it. While the Vietnam era CWC watches are a bit bigger at 36 millimeters, they have no relevance to World War II or my father's service. So what do? Heck, I want one of these Ord department watches. Even if I only wear it a couple of times a year, I think it would be a great remembrance of my father and his service. But I'm not rushing into any purchase. These watches are plentiful, and virtually every day another appears on eBay or other selling venues. I'll take my time and purchase a watch that I really like and at a reasonable price, whether it takes me weeks or months or even longer. You can be assured that once I have one, I'll give it a full review on this channel. So don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell icon so that you are alerted whenever I post a new video. And please, if you've already subscribed, please remember to set that bell icon. It really helps my channel and my ability to continue to make new content. Now, if you want to see similar videos, here is one on selecting a field watch. And here is one on picking a classically designed Flieger watch. As always, thanks for your time, and I'll see you in my next video.